Our second speaker is Danielle Jo. It's okay?
Yes.
She's a researcher from South Korea. She obtained her PhD in classics in the King's College of London in 2018. Today, she's going to present her paper, Traveling Ideas Across Postcolonialism and Romanization, a comparative study of the Romanization discourse from postcolonial perspective in Anglo-American and French scholarship in 20th and 21st centuries. So, Danielle.
Hi everyone, I'm Danielle Jo. I'm recently awarded PhD from King's College London. First, I'd like to express my gratitude to the conveners for hosting the exciting conference and also offering this wonderful opportunity to be part of it. I hope to add something that is worthy of your time and attention, and something that may spark your interests. Without further ado, let me present my doctoral thesis, Traveling Ideas Across Postcolonialism and Romanization. The framework of Romanization that Francis Haverfield and Camille Julien most notably formulated in the early 20th century, respectively in Anglo-Saxon and French scholarship, generated an ongoing discourse by the following generations of scholars to update, modify, and revise the framework, which has developed into Romanization studies. Conceived at the height of European imperialism and American optimism in the early 20th century, before a series of turn of events, including World Wars, the Great Depression, and decolonization, the framework of Romanization in general displayed a perspective characteristic of the era, that of being sympathetic towards the great ancient power of the Roman Empire, when decolonization and post-colonialism from the mid-20th century onwards surrounded historians of the following generation with new social, economic, and political configurations. They avail themselves of new ideas and theoretical frameworks at the time to reflect on the earlier discourse and to propose alternative paradigms. Thanks to scholars of the later generation who have been raising questions that colonialist ideologies had impinged on the classical studies, and particularly on Romanization studies, nowadays, it has become almost unimaginable to discuss Romanization without post-colonialism. Yet it is still worth revisiting the question, is post-colonialism a useful analytical to re-examine Romanization? Can post-colonialism improve our understanding of Roman Empire? Isn't it ahistorical? Jane Webster answers the question that, quote, what are compared are not colonialism, but the discourses which enable colonialism, unquote. What it can provide is not a comparative analysis, but an epistemological shift to deconstruct colonial discourse in Roman historiography. Please allow me to give you a brief description of Romanization discourse prior to the epistemological shift by post-colonialism. The Roman Empire had been an unfailing reference point throughout the early 20th century intellectual dialogues. At first, a long-standing tradition of the Grand Tour and the following neoclassical movement in art and architecture brought the ancient Greek and Roman civilization visibly closer to the eyes of modern minds. Then the ever more expanding power of Britain, France, and America brought the ancient Greek and Roman imperialism mentally closer to them. Whether in order to better comprehend their own powers by comparison, or to surpass another great ancient power, intellectuals and scholars of the time looked to the Roman Empire for wisdom and insights among many other great historical empires. Views on the Roman Empire were far from uniform. Standpoints ranged from that of British imperial civil servants to that of American professional academics. Approaches varied from old gentlemanly scholarship of exemplary history to new professional academics' critical history, and evaluations diverged from admiration to disapproval. The parallel discourse between ancient Roman and British imperialism was prevailing as the well-spread term Pax Britannica after Pax Romana manifest. The identification was far from an implicit assumption. The political and intellectual climate of the time revolved around drawing lessons from a comparison of the ancient and modern imperial powers and their colonies. Professional academic historians were not isolated from the current. Although their methodological rigor and critical perspective set them apart from gentlemen scholars, positivist history of professional academics still operated within the same regime of truth with respect to colonialism. For example, notions such as the dialectic between the civilized colonizer and the barbarian colonized, and the progress of civilization through imperialism stood steadfast. The parallel discourse refashioned itself from the mere study pivoting on personal experiences of politician gentlemen scholars to the comparative study referring to organized evidences by professional academics. The collusion of classics between classics and empire did not come to an end with the advent of professedly objective history, but rather continued to be built into the new regime of truth for critical Roman history. Effectively, until the rise of revisionism in the 1970s, Haverfield's framework of Romanization dominated the discourse. He underlines the long peace, safety, and stability within the empire reinforced by Romanization. Resorting to the dichotomy between civilization and barbarism, he conjured up the Roman Empire as an enclosure to preserve civilization. Romanization, according to Haverfield, was a linear progress of civilization in which Romans handed over the torch of civilization to the uncivilized but intelligent natives. Now, in order to understand the process of post-colonialism, have reoriented Roman discourse, a concept of traveling theory put forward by Edward Said is useful. The traveling ideas is not a simple misinterpretation, but a new idea transformed by new users in a new time and place. Therefore, understanding a traveling idea requires a comparative study between the point of departure and the point of arrival. In fact, post-colonialism itself is one of the best examples of traveling theory, since it was established as a body of theories as a French post-structuralist thoughts traveled to Anglo-Saxon intellectual world. Then it has traveled across disciplines and across borders and has left far-reaching impacts across the intellectual world. The path of traveling post-colonial ideas to the Romanization discourse is far from a linear movement across one academic discipline to another. It traverses periphery and the center of both ancient and modern times, brings the spaces connected through both ancient Roman and modern Western imperial history together, and presents the possibility of decolonizing deep-rooted history and epistemology. At the risk of oversimplification here, I attempt to identify main trajectories that are relevant to my question. The point of departure can be traced back to Foucault and the key figures of post-thinkers such as Bayer, Spivak, and Fanon and Barber. Of course, I do not attempt to give a landscape overview of post-colonial theories here. Rather, I focus on the significance of post-colonialism in question, which pivots on the questioning of history. To put it briefly, Foucault first questioned teleologies and totalization of traditional history, and argues that historical knowledge is discursively formed according to each society's regime of truth. If post-structuralism led to the Western self-consciousness about its historical relativity, post-colonial thinkers directed the very issue back to the Western historiography and its regime of truth by pushing the epistemological boundaries to the colonized other. Said and Spivak addressed the issue of the muted colonized other in Western historiography, and Fanon and Barber attempted to produce alternative history by inverting or subverting the relationship between the self and other fixed in colonial epistemology. This post-colonial epistemological shift traveled to trigger a paradigm shift in Romanization discourse. I'm sorry. The Kuhnian paradigm shift is an appropriate concept to explicate how different models of Romanization proposed during the second half of the 20th century have challenged the traditional worldview. Yet the paradigm shift did not occur independently. The paradigm shift in Romanization discourse was a part of a wider intellectual epidemics initiated by traveling ideas of post-colonialism. Tipping point, a concept popularized by Malcolm Gladwell to understand social epidemics, seems appropriate to understand the phenomenon. What is meaningful to our purpose is that when applied to in the intellectual sphere, Gladwell sheds light on how an idea can travel across a given field and, in fact, wider discipline to tip a worldview. In other words, if Kuhnian's paradigm shift explains how post-colonialism theoretically revolutionizes the worldview, Gladwell's tipping point explains how post-colonialism practically revolutionizes the worldview by inspiring further epistemological shifts in different corners. According to Gladwell, one of the way of understanding tipping point is to look at an epidemic curve, which starts slowly, tipping just as the early adopters start using the seed, then rising sharply as the majority catches on. Here's a rough sketch of the trouble of post-colonialism in Roman scholarship using Gladwell's model of tipping point. First change took place in the age of decolonization in mid-20th century, when the lingering shadow of Western imperial glory that had endured up until the early 20th century plunged into turbulence and instability in the mid-20th century. High hopes fueled by British and American territorial expansion, political dominance, and economic growth no longer deluded a new generation in the face of Great Depression, the Second World War, and decolonization. The United States of America survived a time which is then one of the big superpowers during the Cold War, leaving Europe behind in the shadows of bygone glory. Nevertheless, it has become undeniable that the Western values and thoughts cradled the newer struggle crisis. Mounting doubts about traditional Western ideals made a sea change in the intellectual landscape unavoidable. Meanwhile, Marxism became a buzzword that uniquely penetrated the era. With respect to the discipline of history, focus was drawn to social structures, economic forces, and methodologies were borrowed from the social sciences such as sociology, anthropology, and economics, to name but a few. In particular, Marxism, as well as the Anna School and the Econometrics Revolution, stood out as an influential intellectual movement to drive the scholarship of history to the new stage. Not only the external change, but internal changes within the discipline also played their parts in shaping the course of diffusion. The marginalized position of classes in ancient history within the social and political hierarchy inevitably repositioned Roman historians. The old ties between imperial elites of British and other European empires, and that particularly within the Oxonian classics, became merely a memory of a bygone golden age. While Roman scholars lost their privileged authority, they found an acute need to promote classics in ancient history and make the ancient world relevant to the modern public. This, along with the aforementioned factors, shifted the historical interests and perspectives. However, the scholarship of ancient history in general maintained a tendency to keep some skeptical distance from the scholarship of modern history. Despite the delay compared with the scholarship of modern history, the intellectual shift of the time eventually unraveled in the scholarship of ancient history, mainly through the earliest adopters, that is here, Moses Finley and William Harris. The early adopters of post-structuralist epistemological shift first appeared to bring the question of authority to Roman scholarship, that is, othering the Romans from the modern South. They did not address the issue of Romanization per se, but their destabilizing of parallel discourse deep-rooted in Roman historiography made the first significant step towards making way for post-colonial epistemological shift to take hold. In his monumental piece, Asian Economy, published in 1973, Finley fundamentally argues the rupture between the ancient pre-capitalistic and the between the ancient pre-capitalistic and the modern capitalistic mentalities. One of the starkest contrasts that set these two mentalities apart is that ancient Greeks and Romans of a certain status sought wealth from the political or military arena rather than commercial or industrial activities. It follows that the ancient economy was qualitatively incomparable with the modern capitalistic economy. Finley rejects a modern economy analysis which assumes the profit-driven agents to be rational as anachronistic to explain ancient economy, which was operated by the status-regulated agents. It therefore cuts off the continuum of the capitalistic economy, progressing from ancient economy on one end and the modern economy on the other. What is perhaps less overt but no less significant about his thesis is that he crucially destabilizes the teleology and totalization of the historical narrative that Western self progressed from the ancient classical to modern capitalistic society. The intellectual currents in and out of Roman scholarship, the legacy of Finley and the Vietnam syndrome contributed to introducing a paradigm shift, but the impetus towards social and economic history started to pick up momentum in the scholarship of Asian history. Harris harnessed the contemporary intellectual spirit to challenge one of the most firmly established historical concepts in Roman scholarship, that is, defensive imperialism. In essence, he argues that the Romans did not seek defensive frontiers for war and expansion, but wealth and power. The Romans expanded their empire aggressively, setting ancient Roman imperialism side by side with modern American imperialism. He urges us to realize that Romans also pursued aggressive and exploitative imperialism. However, he emphasized a different ancient and modern mentalities towards war and imperialism. The modern mentality rebukes war and imperialism, whereas the ancient mentality championed it. The American conduct surrounding the Vietnam War might provide a mirror to the aggressiveness and exploitation of Roman imperialism, but it would be a fatal misunderstanding to consider that this reflects the Asian mentality as well. The blind spot is to conflate the two mentalities. Instead, he contrasts the prevailing American mood with the Asian mentality to stress its foreignness. His radical proposition that the Romans aggressively sought war and expansion laid these previous assumptions bare. By challenging them at the root, he then effectively calls the entire interlocked discourses into question, from the civilized Romans, as opposed to the barbarian natives, to the parallel between ancient Romans and modern Europeans and Americans, to defensive imperialism. His alternative premise of Roman mentality betrays and challenges the premises upon which the regime of historical knowledge and truth has been built thus far. The prospect that the civilized Romans do not differ much from the barbaric Goths, Huns, Vikings, or the modern aggressive colonialists was threatening to the established Western system of knowledge and truth. Harris echoes the limitation of post-structuralism to be inflected towards the modern South. He raises questions while firmly rooted in the perspective of modern Western South. From the position of modern Western South, he challenges to reposition the ancient Romans as the other and to reorient the historiography of Roman imperialism. But his discourse keeps referring back to the modern Western South as a point of epistemology. The self-reflexive nature of his discourse is unavoidably locked in the modern Western South. The colonized other, required to deconstruct the imperialist epistemology, is still absent in the discourse of Roman imperialism. In the late 20th century, Millett and Wolff signaled a tipping point to question Roman-centric historiography. Millett's paradigm of Romanization reconfigures the power structure in the Romanization process in favor of the Britons. It grants more leverage to the Britons to wield in the Romanization process. It deploys fundamentally the same framework of binary hierarchical relationship between the colonizers and colonized, but turns it into a negotiation process where the ancient British elites, although colonized, played a pivotal role. Since the Romans ruled indirectly through the local elites commanded a crucial position of negotiation between the two forces. It transforms the ancient Britons from uncivilized and intelligent barbarians to civilized members mediating between the two cultures. He remodels the paradigm of Romanization accordingly. While Roman and British scholars of preceding generation had conceived of Romanization as a one-way process in which the colonizing Romans civilized the colonized Britons, Millett redefines it as a process of dialectical change, in which Roman culture interacted with native culture to produce a synthesis that we call Romanized. The continuity from an old model lurks beneath this model, but what he accomplishes is to empower the subjected elites. As flagrant praises of imperialism had no place in the late 20th century intellectual world, a certain progressive shift has been achieved in tandem with the contemporary mood. However, just as the Eurocentric epistemology still prevails in the contemporary world, Roman-centric epistemology ingrained in their discourse proved to be difficult to release. In 1998, Ulf published a seminal work that became another tipping point to push the boundaries, Becoming Roman. Going further than previous historians who had touched upon the issues raised by post-structuralism and post-colonialism, Ulf addresses the fundamental issue, that is, imperialist power and knowledge entrenched in the Romanization discourse. Ulf identifies self-reflexive and self-serving Roman discourse, where the Roman-central regime of truth of civilized ethos has been constructed to enable and sustain Roman military, economic, and cultural imperialism of the other. At the core of this discourse lies the concept of humanitas. It was simply a byword for Roman virtues, but it was not, but an ideological tool to legitimize rule of Roman elites. By placing themselves on the top level of the humanitas, the Roman elites saw their collective self as the ultimate human beings and dehumanized the others as lesser human beings. This Roman system of knowledge and truth served its ideological end to distinguish the better self from lesser other and to rationalize for the self to colonize the other. Romanization was a process of the colonized other partaking in the discourse, regime of truth, and network of power configurations. By the turn of the century, Jane Webster, Richard Hingley, and David Matterney proposed alternative paradigms to reorient Romanization studies. As post-colonial thinkers posed the question of authority directly back to the Western historiography to break away from Eurocentric system of power and knowledge, these three historians posed more or less the same question directly back to Roman historiography. Webster points out that the debate amongst the earlier models in essence presupposed a linear acculturation, henceforth reduced the natives as reactionaries to mitigate the top-down influence, whether resistant or persistent. She proposes creolization as an alternative paradigm to move beyond the two poles and to convey fluidity and ambiguity in new culture. She proposes the colonized subalterns counterculture as a point in which the authority of Roman imperialism and Romanization is subverted and dispersed. If both the Romans and their aspiring Romans operated within the Roman system of power and knowledge truth, the subaltern order operated on its peripheries. Instead of a variance of linear acculturation model based on colonial dialectics, Webster proposed an alternative paradigm of creolization as a multilateral process which extends to the subaltern order and disperses the colonial dialectics. On the other hand, Hingley proposes a model of globalization. To put it briefly, he brings top-down elite perspectives and bottom-up non-elite counterparts together. He analyzes that simply replacing the top-down perspective with the bottom-up one, for example, the negotiation model that emphasizes native agency, still locked in the colonial epistemology. According to him, a negotiation model which shifts the agency to the natives is a mirror reflection of the old model of Romanization and doesn't push the epistemological boundaries to write an alternative history. It proposes to bring top-down and bottom-up forces together as a way to introduce epistemological shift. He maintains that two forces resulted in fragmented identities in a globalized culture. Depending on where each individual is situated in the structures of differences, whether urban or rural, elite or non-elite, male or female, negotiating or conflicting, each took up a differentiated position to comprise discrepant experiences within the Roman Empire. If Webster and Hingley's alternative paradigms were focused on shifting epistemologies, Matterney attempts to channel these into an alternative historical narrative. Crucially, Matterney asks, can we reconstruct a British perspective on these events? A question that evokes Spivak's pivotal work, Can the Subaltern Speak, in 1988. The paradigm shift that Matterney seeks, on the other hand, rests on the receiving end of Roman aggressive imperialism, that is, the colonized subaltern order. Matterney maintains that the post-colonial paradigm should be more forthright to expose and integrate the brutal nature of colonial power and its consequences into historical narratives. Thus far, We trace the journey of traveling ideas from the point of departure to the point of arrival and examined how post-colonialism diffused into and shifted the Romanization discourse, almost exclusively in Anglo-Saxon scholarship. Now it begs the question, why is the discussion on another point of arrival, French scholarship, absent? As mentioned earlier, because post-colonialism of interest here is a Franklin intellectual phenomenon, its immediate reach, Anglo-Saxon and French scholarship, is a natural scope to trace the journey of traveling ideas and to compare the 2 points of arrival. Where Anglo-Saxon scholarship underwent the intellectual epidemic of post-colonialism, of which an epidemic curve can be traced through the works of the early adopters, French scholarship did not experience the same post-colonial epidemic. In short, French scholarship of Roman history, as well as the general scholarship to a certain extent, regards post-colonialism as an Anglo-Saxon phenomenon. Post-colonial discourse in French scholarship is largely limited to reporting to the recent developments in Anglo-Saxon scholarship. The 2 points of arrival, Anglo-Saxon and French scholarship, significantly diverged. Post-colonialism traveled to Anglo-Saxon scholarship, tipped the epistemological shift through the early adopters, and moved the Romanization discourse towards a paradigm shift, whereas it was lost amidst the epistemological anarchy in French scholarship. As post-colonialism took different positions across the channel, it traveled to the Romanization discourse of each scholarship through different routes and resulted in very different scholarly landscape. Thank you.